Stories. My name is Tennyson E. Stead. I'm the creator of Jump Rangers. And this is the show where I read things that I'm writing in the Jump Rangers universe and then probably edit and discuss them for your viewing pleasure. Today we're reading Jump Rangers, a game called Conquest, Chapter 22. If you'd like to catch up on previous episodes of Ranger Stories, you can find those episodes on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/at Jump Rangers. Let's begin. Most colonies have a brig, which is basically just a holding area with bars where they keep people who got in trouble. Well, just where they keep people locked up. When the sergeant and I woke up, we were lying on the benches in one of the cells of the brig. I think we don't need that sentence right there. In Deep Down Base, so most colonies have a brig, which is basically just a holding area with bars where they keep people locked up. In Deep Down Base, the brig is a long, skinny room with 3 cells along each of the longer walls, and another cell at the end. On the far end of the cell block, there's a guard station with a bunch of lockers. My guess was that one of those lockers had our gear in it. Both the Sarge and I, when we woke up, okay. On the far end of the cell block, there's a guard station with a bunch of lockers. When we woke up, both the Sarge and I were lying on bunks in one of those cells. Both of us guessed that one of those lockers had our gear in it. Behind the console, a guard was watching security feeds. Another guard strode back and forth around the long bench that runs the length of the cell block, checking on the prisoners. As the guard marched past, marched better. I asked her whether she had a problem locking up Jump Rangers and whether we could maybe get a little help. All she did was smirk at me. Or smirking, she ignored me. She ignored my question. That's better. Our heads felt like they were splitting open. Screamers are technically non-lethal weapons, but they can damage a person's hearing. Some people have problems with loud noise, which can overwhelm their senses and cause all kinds of trauma. What I'm saying is that using screamers against little kids isn't the kind of thing a role model should be doing. Mad as I was, the Admiral's use of non-lethal weapons wasn't even close to our biggest problem. Why were we here? Why hadn't Scrap just popped in and flickered us away? When Admiral Paxis came in, when Admiral Paxis finally came to visit, he sat down on the bench that runs the length of the brig, and he talked to the sergeant and I about what our situation was and what our options were. He tried to convince us that Scrap had flickered out when the screamer went off. Maybe. One thing I do know is that Admiral Paxis is the kind of grown-up who will hit you with a screamer because he doesn't like what you have to say. One thing I know for sure and that I learned very recently, is that Admiral Paxis is the kind of grown-up who will hit you with a screamer because he doesn't like what you have to say. Pseudopaxis is the kind of grown-up who is willing to let a pair of kids stay in the brig until we do what he wants. Neither of these people gets to tell me who my friends are. Maybe Scrap managed to get away. Let's see here. Maybe Scrap managed to get away, but maybe the Screamer knocked them out. So I made a little adjustment there. So I wanted the flow of the paragraph to feel a little better. What I wrote was, maybe. One thing I know for sure, and that I learned very recently, is that Admiral Paxis is the kind of grown-up who will hit you with a Screamer because he doesn't like what you have to say. While I'm pointing fingers, Sudropaxis is the kind of grown-up who is willing to let a pair of kids stay in the brig until we do what he wants. Until you do what he wants. Neither of these people get to tell. Neither of these people gets to tell me who my friends are. Maybe Scrap managed to get away, but maybe the Screamer knocked him out. Maybe the Paxis brothers have them tucked away somewhere. And they don't and the people in charge don't want the Sarge and I looking for our friends. Don't want the Sarge and I to know. Even after the Sarge and I don't want me or the Sarge to know. Even after the Sarge and I had been screamed up and locked up, such as we were, I wondered if I was being paranoid for thinking that the Admiral and the Commander might try to force Scrap into something. Might try to kidnap Scrap for some reason. Might try to kidnap Scrap for themselves and keep him and keep. Maybe they want. Okay. Even after the Sergeant and I had been screamed up and locked up, such as we were, I wondered if I was being paranoid for thinking that the Admiral and the Commander might jump at the chance to kidnap a Mistling, to kidnap a Nomad. Maybe they want to study Scrap's flickering. Maybe they want the technology. What I knew for sure was that the Sergeant and I couldn't leave Deep Down Base until we knew for sure that Scrap was safe. Priority 1 was to get out of the cell block with our gear. Priority 2 was to find Scrap if possible and to rescue them if necessary. Once that's done, we can flicker out of here, we can make the trip back to Dragon City and leave the old-fashioned way. If that's the game we're playing, the Sergeant and I will need to steal a bike, probably a quad. Steal a ride, probably a quad. My gear was all locked up. Nothing in my pockets was shiny enough to reflect the lasers. The laser bars of our cell, and I didn't have my data deck for hacking, but that guard has a data deck. They've got a pistol, too. While these laser bars run pretty close together, they were built for grown-ups. Whoever built these cells wasn't planning on keeping kids in them. Wasn't planning on keeping kids in prison. When the guards stepped past our cell on their rounds, the Sarge reached out to try and swipe the data pad. Grabbing the pad was a distraction. Grabbing the pad was just a distraction, but the Sarge still managed to swipe it for to snag it for me. When the guard turned around, spun around to grab the Sarge's hand, that's when I grabbed her blaster. Blasting the laser emitters shut the cell down. Stepping out into the cell block, I told that guard to keep her hands where I could see them and open up my locker. Once we had control of the cell block, we stuffed the guards in one of the cells and strapped up our gear. Detention blocks have access to the security system of Deep Down Base, while the console didn't have the authority to access security cameras in the rest of the base. While the console in our cell block, let's see, we don't need this. Well, the console in our cell block, so this is the beginning of the paragraph, didn't have access to security cameras. It did access the security network itself. It did access the security network. It did access the network. All we needed. It did have a comm. Pretending to be one of the guards. I called up the main security office and got myself a password. Clicking through the security cameras of Deep Down Base, didn't have access to it. Did have a comm. Pretending to be one of the guards, I called up the main security office and got myself a password. Soon enough, I was in the system. Clicking through the security cameras, while the console in our subject didn't have the authority to access security cameras. There we go. Peeking through the security cameras of Deep Down Base, we spotted a lab with a sealed isolation tank like the kind they used to study alien organisms. Inside, surrounded by gas, you could just make out the rise and fall of Scrap's sleeping form. Of course, the Admiral had guards posted outside the lab. Of course, technicians were working around the clock to study our missling friend. Of course, they had the Starpike under a microscope while they picked at it with probes and tweezers. The nomads. Getting into the lab was pretty straightforward once we had our wrench rigs. Sneaking into the lab was pretty straightforward once we had our wrench rigs. Getting small, we climbed in through the air filters. None of those technicians wanted to fight a jump ranger, and we locked down the lab so the guards couldn't get in. Breaking Scrap out of the isolation tank was simple. But the drugs they pumped into Scrap's air supply took a long time to clear out of the mislings. But the drugs they pumped into Scrap's air supply were another story. Even after Scrap woke up, they were too woozy to feel safe about flickering. Teleporting across the galaxy is not something you want to do when you're not feeling like yourself. When you're not feeling quite yourself. I'm going to work on the voice of this. My next rewrite is going to be about bringing out some of the tonal inconsistencies and some of the sort of the language's inconsistency in terms of how Wrench speaks, but also I want to bring in a little bit more of a quaintness to it because it should feel a little bit storybooky, even as Wrench brings a sense of authenticity. I want that authenticity to come through a comfortable framework, and that's going to take some time to get at. I think that's going to be when I get there. It's going to be one of the really appealing parts of reading this book, but it's going to take some time. Everything was very bright in this lab. Most of Deep Down Base was dark, but this place had a lot of clean, well-lit workspaces. Had clean, well-lit workspaces. When we asked the technicians about it, they told us that this was where they studied Saurian technology, animals, and plants when the scouts would bring them in from outside. Messing around with Saurian tech, sometimes you wind up setting off a chain reaction. In this matter, I speak from personal experience. Wild animals. Wild animals can get ornery in a lab, and sometimes they'll try to eat a person. Sometimes plants release gases you weren't expecting, or they turn out to be carnivorous, or they grow too fast and take over the colony. Does this lab have an emergency disposal for things that are fixing to explode or eat people or what have you? As a matter of fact, it did. Grabbing our groggy space mouse friend, the Sarge stuffed them in a pocket. Without wasting any time, we dumped ourselves down the emergency chute into the hazard disposal vault. Basically, the vault is just a huge shielded room with a massive blast door that opens from the outside. Getting very, very small, I fixed a boomer to my firecracker and shot it through the door jamb at the vault's locking mechanism. And shot it through the door jamb into the vault's locking mechanism. Most of the time, that door fits pretty snug. When you're small enough, it gets to be the size of an alleyway. Most of the time, that door fits pretty snug. The space between those blast doors gets to be the size of an alleyway. Even when they're tiny, boomers pack quite a punch. Cracking that lock open was all that stood between us and escape, and pretty soon I had the door. That's all I need. Keeping Scrap in his helmet, the Sarge and I survived on the surface of Soros for a few days before Scrap was well enough to flicker. Scooting back to the Ranger's roost, we warned Slappy that Sutropaxis was stuffing Rangers in jail cells back at Deep Down Base. High Command wasn't on Planet Link, but they'd be coming back through before long. When they did, we asked Slappy to have them meet us at the Alien City Ranger Hab. Admiral Paxis had turned down our plan to save Earth. Now it was time for High Command to decide whether they were going to help us anyway. That's the end of the chapter. Again, I think we're making good progress. This is going to take some time before it's ready to be published. But I think the story is good. And right now, that's what I need. It's a rough draft. I've written so many screenplays that work, as a rough draft that I think I've spoiled myself a little bit. And I think this is kind of a little bit of a return to humility for me in my writing process. But what's really going to make this book work is the language and the tone of it, and it is Wrench telling this story, and I want it to feel honest and sincere and also very safe, which is tough because there's a lot of exciting action scenes and there's a lot of stuff that's dangerous. Wrench is doing things that kids should do, and the Sarge is, and that's part of Jump Rangers, is finding that tonal balance. I think that's going to be a big part of what makes this work as something that you read to kids, or as something that kids read to themselves. And if it works on that level, then the grown-ups who are kind of rediscovering their inner child through Jump Rangers are going to like it too. So we're taking baby steps in that direction. But the story is good, and I think we cleaned up some things here. And that's all I have to say about that. I'll be back on Saturday, I believe, with another installment of Metagame. Anybody who was there for our last stream know how much fun we had, and I look forward to wrapping up our story and getting into a new one. I'm going to do some changes to the. There were some things that came up with regards to the character advancement system that I'm going to try and tackle tonight after I do some coverage. It's a good week for Jump Rangers. It's a good week for Jump Rangers, and I will see you on Saturday. Thank you very much for watching. Don't be a stranger, Ranger, and I'll catch you later.